Hey there, everybody. Happy Wednesday to you all. We have a special Twitter space set up for you today. We have Mike Craven of Dave Campbell's Texas Football joining us this evening. We're going to talk about football all throughout the state of Texas. We are super amped to have him on board and super excited to talk about everything that is happening in the Lone Star State. Of course, this is JD Moore stepping in on the main account with Reddit CFB. I am joined by my co-hosts today, Chris Derrett and Sirius. Gentlemen, how are you this evening?
I'm doing good,
fantastic.
guys. Thanks for having me.
One day closer to football, JD, so life is great.
I know. I am so excited. We are roughly about 10 days from those first kicks happening. And Mike, I know you have been all over the state recently, talking with all these coaches, with all these administrators, all these players. What kind of excitement should we be looking forward to in the state of Texas for football?
Yeah, it should be a pretty good year. I kind of joke that walking out of all the magazine interviews, kind of when you go and do the car wash at each school, you talk to head coach, a coordinator or two, a couple players, you talk to the SID, and you walk out of there and you're like, man, Rice is going 12-0, and it's like that everywhere, where optimism is really high. Spring football's over. Everybody feels pretty good about where they're at. And then I think another part of it is the transfer portal, for as much as it's talked about negatively, I think when you talk to the coaches, their roster's as good as they've ever been in college football, right? Because you get, those 10 or 12 guys that used to be kind of dead weight scholarship off your books. They end up transferring out, and you get 10 or 12 guys who are kind of ready-made to at least be in the two deep. So a lot of excitement around the state. 3 out of the 12, FBS programs have new coaches, so that always kind of brings, a new level of excitement. Baylor, UTSA coming off a conference championship. So should be a pretty good year for the FBS ranks in the state of Texas. And then, of course, we cover the FCS too, and Incarnate Word, SFA should be really good and competing for that as well.
Yeah, Mike, before we kind of dive into all the different programs and all the storylines, can you describe the state of Texas football in 2022, which, for a lot of folks is kind of the real return, to quote unquote normal. 2021, we were able to get into stadiums and practice and play football, but is there a different sense of kind of return to excitement and routine and without, all of the worries and, kind of precautions that we've needed to take over the last couple of years?
I think so. I think to the point where, you don't really hear it brought up much in press conferences or talking to coaches about, how you kind of juggle that. If you talk to coaches, they got 1,000 things to juggle, and adding anything to it is tough for them. They're creatures of habit like all of us. They're kind of control freaks. I think that's what makes them really good at their job. So having one less thing to really worry about or one less obstacle to navigate around is of course going to be good. And, I think on the fan side, on the media side, it's great just to be back around these programs. There's open practices going on. There's autograph sessions going on. You can have one-on-ones with players. Press conferences are back to in-person. There's no masks around. You kind of get a feel of people again. And I think that's important. I think that's good. And I think that only adds to our excitement level to the game of football, because college football, you can go out and touch it. It's different than a lot of big-time sports in that way. And I think it's getting back to that again, and that's good.
With all these programs coming back, again, there's, I think, about 13, if we count the Sam Houston State Bearcats transitioning up into FBS. Out of all these 13 programs, what do you think has the most interesting storyline coming into this upcoming season?
I honestly think it may be Houston. They have a chance to really crash the college football playoff party this year in the same way Cincinnati did last year. They got a chance to go to Texas Tech and get a win. They're going to have to go to UTSA and get a win. The conference schedule breaks out pretty nicely. They don't have to play Cincinnati until eventually an AAC championship game if they get there. When we go back a year ago, when Dana Holgorsen and Houston lost that first game to Texas Tech after they had the lead and Clayton Thorson throws 4 interceptions, and it's like, hey, what's going on here? Does Holgorsen know what he's doing at Houston? Is this going to get turned around? Flash forward a year, and they're ranked in the top 25, and a lot of people consider them the best G5 school in the nation. I don't think any of the Power 5 programs are national title contenders yet. I think A&M's probably a year or two away from that as their young guys develop. So for me, it's at the G5 level, and it's Houston to see if they can go undefeated and get into that conversation, depending on how it goes in the Power 5, right? If if there's 4 undefeated Power 5 conference champions, this is a moot point. But if things break right and Houston takes care of its business and goes 13-0 with a win over Cincinnati, a win over Texas Tech, a win at UTSA, I think they got a real chance of getting into the playoff like Cincinnati did last year. The precedent's been set.
Mike, it seems like Clayton Thornson's development as a quarterback for Houston has been really key to them taking that step to the next level. What do you see in terms of what he's been able to accomplish so far? Because he's made a lot of progress. And is there a little bit more there that he could grab to kind of elevate them up into, playoff contention this year?
For sure. I think with Clayton, it was just learning that the ball is valuable, right? Throwing the ball away is okay. Punting is okay. I think you can get into that gunslinger mentality, especially early on. He kind of got thrown into the fire. He was the quarterback that took over for De'Aaron King when De'Aaron King played for 4 games and then abruptly kind of quit the team and transferred to Miami kind of mid-year when this was all still kind of new and weird. And so he had to play a lot right away. And then the pandemic year happened, and how do you become a leader of a program during all that kind of stuff? I think last year when he threw those 4 interceptions, they lost to Texas Tech. And he rebounded to only throw 6 the rest of the way, another 13 games after that, including a win over Auburn in the Liberty Bowl. I think he really just proved to his teammates that he's, a tough, durable guy that can handle adversity. They were good enough at other spots. That defense was really good to where he didn't have to go score, 45 points a game for them to win. I think this year he kind of takes a little bit more of the reins. It's going to be a lot more on his shoulders. I think they're going to throw the ball a lot. He's a 6-year senior quarterback. When Dana Holgerson's had those in his career, they've put up really big numbers. Alton McCaskill, their star running back, got hurt in the spring. So, who knows if they're going to need to throw the ball a little bit more to make up for that. So I think he's poised to throw for nearly 4,000 yards, reach 40 touchdowns. It's going to be a big year for Clayton Thorson if he can stay healthy. Again, it's just avoiding the turnovers. When he's been really good, he's played a clean game and scrambled, got yards, thrown the ball away. When he's been bad, he's tried to force it. So whichever one of those Clayton Thorson shows up, I think will dictate how far Houston can go this year.
Yeah, Mike, on the flip side of seemingly always, historically very high expectations, Texas A&M and Texas, can you tell me a little bit about what you feel like are the emerging storylines? Obviously, a high-powered A&M team and Texas team that's always loaded with a lot of talent, and it's always a matter of whether it can, come together or not.
Yeah, I'll start with A&M. I think for them, they're a year away, right? Like that defensive line, I understand is like super good. Like I'm not here to say Walter Nolan's not going to be like a future superstar. And I realize they signed like 7 dudes ranked in the top 100, overall in the nation. I get it. Like A&M is on their way up. But until they have a proven quarterback and a passing game that's any type of consistent, I just can't see them as like the number 6 team in the nation. So I just feel like those expectations are super high for a team that lost 4 conference games last year without that one even being Alabama. They don't upset Alabama. They're 7-5. Are we looking at this program a little bit differently than, 8-4 with that upset over Alabama and that big time recruiting class? So for me, the storyline at A&M is going to be the quarterback position until they figure it out. Is it Max Johnson? Is it Haynes King? Does Connor Wigman kind of become the guy by mid-year if they start playing for 2023, depending how the early season goes? So, I think Jimbo Fisher has shown he's worth every single penny that Texas A&M's got them. I mean, I grew up in the 90s in South Houston, right? And A&M was everybody's favorite school around me and all that kind of stuff. But we never considered A&M like a national contender. Like nobody really thought about it that way in the 90s and into the 2000s. Like now they're in those conversations, and I think that's important. Perception is such a big deal in college football that Jimbo's kind of put them on the map and they have their own footing in the SEC in a way that I don't think they feel threatened all that much by Texas getting there. I think A&M's kind of built their own lane and they're going to be fine with Texas getting to the SEC. On the flip side with the Longhorns, like they just can't stay out of stuff, right? Like Jay Hall's, like beefing with school campus, parking police, and any of us that went to college have probably had the same complaints. So like, I'm not going to get too hard on them on that. But they lose another wide receiver and Isaiah Nayor to injury for the full season. Junior Angelau, the starting right guard, gets injured for the full season. So just a lot of question marks with Texas, and I think that's the deal, right? Like we all admit that the Longhorns are, on paper, one of the top 10 most talented teams in the country. Like Quinn Ewers is one of the best quarterbacks I've ever seen at the high school level. Bijan Robinson's a superstar, right? Xavier Worthy. I mean, all this stuff, right? Their defensive guys are all 4-star dudes. It's not like they lack talent. But can they put it on the field? Like, can that defense not be statistically one of the worst that's ever been in Austin, right? Like, can Pete Kwiatkowski figure it out defensively against the Big 12? Is Quinn Ewers what we think he is? Is the offensive line ready to compete? That Alabama game is going to tell us a lot. Unfortunately, it's going to be a lot on that game. Like, I'm not one of those guys that likes to put too much on one game, but it's going to be one that we overreact to, good or bad. It's going to be interesting to see how Texas matches up, because I think they're fine at the skill positions. But Alabama could really hurt them in the trenches if they're not figured out and they're not better than they were last year, because last year they weren't too good.
You mentioned Quinn Ewers and kind of stepping in for the Texas Longhorns. One thing that I find very interesting, and you tell me as an insider, there seems to be, at least with certain beat reporters and certain Texas media, there seems to be not any kind of major separation between Quinn Ewers and other guys who are currently on the field. Is this a smokescreen? Are we supposed to believe that Quinn Ewers might not be the starter on day one for Texas?
My opinion as a non-beat writer is that this is just kind of tempering expectations. Hudson Card's going to get some drives in that first game. Like, they're going to try to keep this a quarterback competition, for a decent amount of time. They want both of those guys engaged. Steve Sarkisian can only look towards last year to know that he may need two quarterbacks, right? Like, just because Hudson Card doesn't win the job doesn't mean they're not going to need Hudson Card. But I do think Quinn Ewers is going to be the guy. If he takes the first snap or not, like, I don't know. I'm not plugged in enough on a beat writer, situation to be in there day in, day out to know if that's the case or not. But, I do feel like since Quinn's been on campus, they've done everything possible to kind of be like, hey, it's not his job. We're not giving him the job right away. Like, he's not just going to walk into this job. He's not that much better than what we have on campus. To me, that doesn't seem all that sincere, right? Like, a guy like Quinn Ewers, just knowing what we know about Quinn Ewers, he's not going to Texas unless he knows that he's getting that starting job. If he's healthy, if he's not turning the ball over every other snap in practice, it's hard for me to believe that he's not taking the vast majority of snaps for Texas this year.
Mike, speaking of Texas and snaps, it seemed like in the past we've seen Bijan Robinson, as you mentioned, absolutely phenomenal athletes, but at certain times it seemed like he wasn't getting the ball enough down the stretch to close out games when Texas really needed that ground game. Do you expect to see him have a bigger role this season, or is Sark still going to kind of manage the number of snaps he's getting throughout the game?
Yeah, I think they'll manage the snaps. If I'm Sark, I'm managing more of those in the first half than in the second half. And some of that's on Bijan, right? Like, if you're a head coach, you're looking at your running back, he's going to be in the game or he's not going to be in the game, right? When you're getting a Ferrari and that kind of stuff, like, you can't just be told to do, anything and everything, right? So I think some of that's on Bijan. We saw that with like Zach Evans last year at TCU as well. It's like, how much was that Zach's decision? How much of that is the offense's decision? Only a few people probably know that answer for sure. I think Bijan's going to get plenty of touches. He's going to carry the ball 15 to 20 times. He's going to catch the ball 5 to 10 times. Like, he's going to be in that 20 to 30 touch a game ratio when Texas can get him the ball. Him being healthy is really important. And again, this is a guy with NFL aspirations. It's not 1980 anymore. I don't think he's going to have 33 carries in games like Ricky Williams used to at Texas. I think they use him smartly. I think they use him wisely, but I do think they use him plenty.
And Mike, in Austin, what is the expectation, fan base, alumni? What has been your perception of what people are realistically hoping for and maybe those higher hopes that you're gauging from fan base?
Yeah, I think with Texas it's weird, right? You're always going to have those really loud fans that, like, it's 12-0 or bust, right? Like, we're going to beat Bama. Like, like, there's no excuse not to beat Bama. Like, we're Texas. Like, you're always going to have kind of those chest-beating Texas fans that think they're better than everybody and always going to win a lot of games and stuff. But I think most reasonable Texas fans sit at about 8 games. 8-4 would be a good step forward. They have a relatively tough schedule, with the Alabama game being out of conference game at home against a team we all kind of consider the favorite, or at least 1B to be the favorite for national championship. So I think 8-4 with losses against good teams. Like, if they're 8-4 and their losses are Alabama, OU, Baylor, and Oklahoma State, and they're playing pretty good football, and you can see Quinn Ewers as a dude for another year, and that defensive line, offensive line's getting better, I think everybody's like, okay, this is going in the right direction. 10 wins is possible next year. Let's see, what's the conference realignment sits at heading into 2023. If it's anything below 8-4, like if they lose some games that they're not supposed to, specifically if they lose them in the second half in the same way that they did last year, I do think you start hearing some rumbles from the fan base. It'll be interesting to see how much the Arch Manning cachet kind of carries, because in my opinion, that's bottom this year. Like, they could go 5-7 again, but if Arch Manning's committed, I think Steve Sarkisian's safe. It's going to be interesting to see kind of how that works with the fan base, if this thing doesn't go better as it did last year.
That was one of the things that I wanted to ask about with Sarkisian's long-term prospects at Texas. It kind of seems he's got Arch Manning in the wings. That's going to buy him some time. He still always has the, last-ditch effort of fire the coordinators to buy him one extra year. What would you think would be the bare minimum if it is that 5-7 to make sure that he's still got at least a stable year going into next year? Because I don't think anybody's necessarily expecting, Texas to turn around, win the Big 12 this year, go to the college football playoff. But I think everybody wants to see that improvement from Texas. What's going to get that kind of record that makes Steve Sarkisian kind of quell the waters and make people believe that this is the guy for the job?
Yeah, I think 8-9 wins. Like, if they can get to 8-9 wins, I think everybody can look at it and go, okay, this thing is turning a corner. Right, and especially if those 8-9 wins are against teams they're supposed to beat and they play pretty close, good games against, Baylor, Oklahoma, Alabama, that kind of stuff. Now, if they're losing 40 points to Alabama and Oklahoma State, well, then, that's a different conversation. 8-4 is not always equal everywhere, right? But I do think 8 wins kind of gets him that, especially if they sign a top 5 recruiting class, right? Like, just like Jimbo last year, like A&M won 8 games last year. Nobody's talking about Jimbo Fisher's future at A&M, right? Because he's signing the top recruiting class in the nation. They got really good young quarterback coming up in Connor Wigman. Everything seems to be going well there at A&M, that it's, okay, we lost 4 conference games. We're going to get there, blah, 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 blah. I think Texas can pull that same trick, can sell that same snake oil and say, like, hey, maybe we're not at 10 wins like we probably should be as the University of Texas on a year-in, year-out basis, but this thing wasn't very good that I took over from Tom Herman, and it's going to take a little bit of time, and we've gone from 5 wins to now 8 wins. And if we do it in a good way with recruiting momentum going up, I think everybody's going to look at it and go, okay, this thing's on the rails again. Because remember, Tom Herman wasn't really fired for on-field stuff. They won 7 games, right? That year that they went 7-3. The year he got fired. He got fired because Quinn Ewers decommitted and went to Ohio State. He got fired because the Brockenmeyers went to Alabama. So if recruiting and perception is going really, really well for Texas, I don't know if the record's as important as the feelings, if that makes any sense.
Well, those feelings exactly are the same reason why Jimbo Fisher is safe at Texas A&M, because, he's not dropping games at home to Kansas by any means.
Right.
So, but I am curious, at least when it comes to feelings and that kind of shaping and perception of Steve Sarkisian, I really am curious to know, Gary Patterson departed from the TCU program after running it for 20 plus years, built it to where it is. He's now the special assistant to the head coach at Texas. Does this have any kind of effect, at least that you've seen, on the Texas program so far?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know if we'll even know that until the games start. I'm sure behind the scenes, Gary's given them, all sorts of tips, all sorts of advice, all sorts of tells, especially once we get into Big 12 play. I'd imagine, that knowledge is invaluable. I kind of wonder what the idea is for Pete Kwiatkowski, the defensive coordinator, if things don't go well, right? Because, you got arguably the best defensive mind of the 21st century, at least in Big 12 football terms for sure, kind of sitting there, kind of twirling his thumbs, kind of talking to you about X's and O's and stuff. Like, I got the job at Dave Campbell's 10 months ago. If they hired Kirk Bowles tomorrow, I'd be kind of nervous, right? I'd be worried somebody's coming to take my job. I think it's kind of the same thing there for Texas. That defense was not very good last year, and it needs to get better. In my opinion, Pete Kwiatkowski kind of came into the Big 12 thinking it was the old Big 12 of pass the ball around. We need to play 2 deep safety, keep everything in front of us. Well, the new Big 12 will punch you in the mouth. There's a reason Baylor and Oklahoma State were in the Big 12 championship game. They never really adjusted to that. They played a light box. They had the ball ran on them all the time. They wore down in the second half. I don't know how much of that Gary Patterson can fix, but adding a mind like that who's seen it all in the Big 12 with 8 of the teams that they're going to play, I would imagine has to be very valuable for Steve Sarkisian in that program.
Yeah, Mike, right down the list on that top 25, just a couple spots. The Baylor Bears, Sugar Bowl champions. What are your thoughts on what's going to be important for them this season, for Dave Aranda and crew, to sustain that success and not just be a flash in the pan or just kind of one-hit wonder?
I think it starts up front. They have probably the best offensive line and best defensive line in the state, probably in the Big 12. Oklahoma, may have an argument with them on the defensive line talent-wise, but, they're going to win in the trenches. I think Blake Shapen's an upgrade at quarterback. I know, he wasn't the quote-unquote returning starter, so they got to replace that in Gary Bohannon. But, he looked really good in that Big 12 championship game. He looked really good against Texas Tech in that Big 12 finale where that clinched him a spot in the Big 12 championship game. So, I think they've upgraded at quarterback. Now, they did lose, their running backs. But, in my opinion, your running game is more about your offensive line than your running backs. Give me, an average running back behind a great offensive line rather than a great running back behind an average offensive line. So I think with Jeff Grimes at offensive coordinator, you're always going to be able to run the football. Eric Mateos is probably the best young offensive line coach in the nation. I think they're going to be good there. My question for Baylor is at wide receiver. They're just going to have to find some targets. There's a lot of new guys that are unproven, that don't have a lot of experience, don't have a lot of snaps and stats going into this season, so they're going to have to develop that. Playing at BYU early in the year is going to be pretty tough. BYU is one of the top returning production teams in the country, according to Bill Conley. So I think that's going to be a tough matchup. But Dave Aranda is one of my favorite coaches in the country. He's just so different, right? Like, you talk to Dave Aranda, and it's more like talking to a monk than a football coach. Like, most football coaches are kind of rah-rah, bravado-filled, tough alpha male dudes. Like, Dave Aranda kind of gives off a different vibe, and I dig it. I think his team kind of took that, to heart. They were pretty calm under pressure. They won a lot of really close games. It'll be interesting to see if that's flukish. I'm an analytics guy. Sometimes that stuff evens out. Is it flukish, or is that part of the team? We'll find that out with Baylor, but, I think they're good enough to go win the Big 12, and a Big 12 where, Spencer Sanders is the preseason first team all Big 12 quarterback. I mean, I think that says it all about the Big 12. It's wide open. Nobody knows who's going to win that thing. If Baylor wins it, I wouldn't be shocked at all.
Speaking of Baylor, let's do a little bit of a transition over to their long-term rival, TCU. What should we expect from the Horned Frogs with, Sonny Dykes making the very long and arduous journey over to TCU from SMU this year?
As a pretty new resident to DFW, it is a pretty good journey from TCU over to SMU. Depending on traffic and stuff, that can cost you about $40 in an hour and a half of your life. So a pretty good journey over there. I think TCU is one of those teams that has like the biggest variance in college football, or at least in the state of Texas, which is what, I focus on. If you told me right now, if you were from the future and you said TCU won 8 games, I'd be like, yeah, I can see it. They got good quarterbacks coming back. Their wide receivers are great. I really like their offensive line, good running back committee. I think the defense is better than what they played last year. Maybe that odd man front under Joe Gillespie, really helped out. I mean, I can talk myself into TCU winning 9 games. I can also talk myself into TCU winning 3 or 4 games. If the quarterback play is inconsistent, if those kind of freshman, hiccups kind of happen, and first year blues and all that kind of stuff. They just, the transfer portal age, maybe it's just too much change right away to be good in a good conference. So you can talk me into a lot of things with TCU. I'm a Sonny Dykes guy. I like what he's about. I like his honesty. I like his openness. I think it's a breath of fresh air at TCU. You go from Gary Patterson, which there's a lot of good there. I'm not here to disparage Gary Patterson, what he did at TCU. But, you can't get interviewed at TCU when Gary Patterson's the coach. You're not going to go watch practice, all that kind of stuff. And now, anybody can go watch TCU practice. It's a wide-open program. Everybody's there to be seen. I think that's good. I think that's going to help in recruiting. But on the field this year, yeah, like I said, I think there's a lot of different ways that this one can go. I still don't know who's going to be the starting quarterback. And so that'll be interesting in itself to kind of see, what he does with his first big decision there in Fort Worth.
I think one of the other interesting things that's going to be happening in Fort Worth as well is this change on the defensive side of the ball. They've for a long time run Gary Patterson's 4-2-5 defense. They're now switching into that 3-3-5 with the defensive coach coming out of Tulsa. What's kind of been the vibe that you've gotten from the players out in Fort Worth with this type of new scheme coming into the system?
I think they like it, and I think it fits their personnel. I think going a little bit bigger on the defensive line will free up those linebackers. Like a guy like D. Winters, if he can avoid block, he's going to go get 100 tackles, right? Like those kind of dudes, Marcel Brooks, Shadrick Banks, like they have some athletic guys at linebacker that just need to be free and clear. I think last year that defensive line played really bad. The front seven wasn't very good. That bled into the secondary. It just kind of all seemed to not work at one time. Change sometimes is good. There's a reason after 18 years we move out of our parents' house, hopefully, and go do something else with our life. Like sometimes you just need something new. Sometimes you need a new scheme, a new boss, a new voice, something. And I think Joe Gillespie coming in there, we'll bring in something new. We'll switch it up for the players. We'll keep it fresh. We'll keep it exciting. They can only go up. That was about as bad as that TCU defense can get against the run, in my opinion. I mean, they allowed, I think, 34 rushing touchdowns, something crazy like that. So they can only get better. I think that offense is going to do them some favors too. I think it's going to score some more points, and that's going to take some pressure off the defense. They don't got to win 21-17 or anything like that. So that's going to be a big question mark. I mean, again, I think they can only get better, and that odd man front should help with the biggest problem they had last year, and that was stopping the run.
Yeah, Mike, on the topic of defense, Dave Aranda has done something very special at Baylor, which is win in the Big 12 without scoring 83 points a game. I was wondering what your thoughts are just on defense in general in the Big 12 and in Texas, and the impact that not just Baylor has had, but the idea that, hey, defense actually can win games in 2022 and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think football is really cyclical, right? Like, we see this kind of ebbs and flows throughout the history of the game where there's some new offensive innovation and it takes defense a decade to catch up, and then the defense catches up and it takes the offense, a decade to figure out the next innovation. This is just the latest form of that. I think when the air raid came out and those principles, even not pure air raid, but air raid principles have kind of bled into all of college football, all of football really, trickled up to the NFL. We see it in high school all the time. And so I think it took a while for defenses to figure out, personnel that, they had to get away from the old school 4-3, the old school 3-4, and start putting 5 defensive backs on there. We were just talking about Gary Patterson. He was kind of on the front foot of that whole innovation. So I think defenses have just gotten faster. They've gotten better in space. They've figured out how to blitz off of different packages and confuse offenses and do just enough to kind of stop them once they're inside the 25, 30-yard line. Now, I think Dave Aranda, as you brought up, is the perfect example. It's not a coincidence. He was the GA under Mike Leach at Texas Tech in 2002, right? He's seen all of this happen for the last 20 years. He spent his whole career trying to stop it in practice and everywhere that he's gone. I think there's a reason he's kind of, an innovator when it comes to facing these modern offenses, and one of the guys who's kind of figured out as much as you can figure it out, right? You're still going to give up a decent amount of points. If we're looking back, in the 1980s, 1990s, like even good defenses today give up a lot of points compared to that. But he's learned how to do the bend but don't break, get some turnovers, get some sacks, some negative plays, some havoc plays, and play defense that way. I think it's just the evolution of the game and young defensive minds that have been playing against these offenses for the last 10, 15, 20 years of their coaching career, finally being in positions to run the defenses that they know can help stop those teams.
We're about 30 minutes in, pausing for a quick station ID. This is our CFB Talk 60. My name is JD Moore, hosting on the main account from Reddit CFB. My co-host Chris Derrett, and Sirius, we've got Mike Craven of Dave Campbell's Texas Football on the space, talking with us about all things football in the Lone Star State. And Mike, I know that on your cover for this year, you had two born and raised and grown Texans with Joey McGuire and Jeff Traylor on the cover of Dave Campbell's Texas Football. Texas Tech is that one Power 5 team that we haven't talked about just yet in terms of Texas football programs. We've had both of those guys on a couple of spaces here, and Joey McGuire on his space was talking, we're going to see a little bit of that old Texas Tech with the air raid principles. And we've seen a lot of energy coming out of Lubbock when it comes to Joey McGuire taking over that program. What kind of Red Raider program should we be expecting on the field with Joey McGuire at the helm now?
I know it's going to be one that's bought in, not just the players, but the admin, the fan base. And that never felt true under Matt Wells. Like, it never felt like everybody was moving in the right direction or everybody was moving in the same direction. Kind of felt like he was kind of not a great fit there. He wasn't recruiting the way that they wanted to. He kind of abandoned Texas high school football in a way that's probably not advantageous at a place like Texas Tech. He wasn't one of their own. And Joey McGuire is one of those dudes that could walk into your family Thanksgiving and convince you he was part of your family. He's that guy, right? Like, he can be anywhere, anytime with anybody, and he's just one of the guys. And I think that works really well when you take over a program that struggled. He's walked in there and you didn't see a lot of transfers out of that program. For example, they kept all 3 quarterbacks that are pretty good, and Tyler Shuck, Donovan Smith, Baron Morton. And those are 3 quarterbacks that are pretty good, and they're all still there under a new staff that didn't even recruit them. I think that speaks volumes to who Joey McGuire is as a head coach. Now, that schedule they have is pretty brutal. Like, it really is a tough schedule. Maybe one of the toughest in the state outside of A&M, just because they got to play in the SEC. So I think Tech is going to struggle to get back to 6 regular season wins. Like, I think it's more likely they win 5 games than they win 7 games. So it may not look great on the field right away, but I think the momentum that they have, not only in recruiting, but in their fan base, being able to sign that whole $25,000 a year to every single player plus 15 walk-ons, I think it just shows, they announced a $200 million renovation to their stadium. I know they're going to upgrade their weight room and their training facility. Like, the guys with money are spending it there now that Joey's there asking for it. And if you have the support of your big money donors in a way that McGuire seems to already have, that buys you a couple years. And if you give Joey McGuire a couple years, his track record suggests he's going to win some football games. He did it at Cedar Hill with a program that, now we look at it and we go like, oh, yeah, you win at Cedar Hill. Well, they had never won a playoff game before Joey McGuire got there. And if you ask anybody at Baylor, a lot of those dudes that just won a Big 12 championship were at Baylor because Joey McGuire recruited them there. And so I think he's going to get his guys. They're going to play some good football. They're going to play hard football, even if they don't win a lot of games early. But I love the staff he put together. Hiring Zach Kitley, I think, was a genius idea. I mean, that guy's, a future head coach, put up like 1 million points last year for Western Kentucky. I think it was cool for him to bring back something that's tangibly like identifiable for the Texas Tech fan base. They can go, hey, that's ours. Like, we've seen that before. We've rooted for that before. That's got us to 10 wins before. Like, we can hold on to that. I think that was a smart idea and a shrewd move by him. And everything he's done so far has worked. Now, they go play Houston, lose that game. They go play North Carolina State, they lose that game. They host Texas, they lose that game. He's going to have to face that stuff. The honeymoon will end eventually, but, they're riding a high right now, and that's good for a program.
I love that you mentioned the staff that he's put together because, again, when you talk about Texas guys who have really built up programs, I mean, Matt Rule kind of wrote that playbook of find all the head coaches that are winning games and put them together on a staff. Joey McGuire, I think he has like 7 total former Texas high school head football coaches. Like, you got Kenny Perry, you got Zarnell Finch, you got Manuel Jones, you've got all these guys who have played Texas high school football and they've coached as head coaches in Texas high school football. What's the importance of making sure that you've got that strong pipeline to Texas recruits if you're a Texas football head coach like a Joey McGuire?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's vitally important. I think we're already seeing the fruits of that labor at UTSA under Jeff Traylor, and we're going to see it under Joey McGuire at Texas Tech too. Like, they can walk into any high school in the state, and that high school coach is going to vouch for them. Like, that high school coach, like John King is the president of the THSCA, and he's the head coach at Longview. And in our in our magazine, feature cover for those guys, he said, look, I'm not going to tell my players where to go, but I can look at them and go, that guy and that guy, speaking of Joey McGuire and Jeff Traylor, aren't lying to you because they can't lie to you, because if they do, they're never allowed back in here again. And we're friends. Like, they're not going to ruin that friendship over a recruit, right? And so I think in the world of recruiting, where there's a lot of wolf tickets sold, where there's a lot of lies, said, where there's a lot of misinformation out there, it helps. The holy trinity in recruiting is still the head coach, the parents, the player. And if you already have the head coach, you only got 2 more to get, in order to pull that one off. And then the other part of that is in the transfer portal era, not only does it give them an in and a vouch where they can go, hey, can you get me in contact with this guy who's in the portal? I'm interested in him. It also gives them some information where they can get some intel, and they can go back to that high school coach and go, hey, one of your guys is in the portal after 2 years. Tell me what's up with him. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he a guy we should take? What was going on with that situation? Give me some information there. So, I think it's a great thing. I think it's a trend we're going to continue to see. And I think the important part is they didn't go from head coach to head coach. Like Todd Dodge talked about how, going from head coach at South Lake Carroll to head coach at North Texas was just disastrous. There was just so many levels of the game that he just didn't know. Both Jeff Traylor and Joey McGuire took 4 years to kind of relearn how to be a head coach at the college level. And now that's going to pay off. And at least it's already paying off at UTSA. I think that's very smart for both of them. And I think those connections to Texas high school football, is only a good thing. It cannot be a negative thing.
Looking at UTSA, Jeff Traylor, what excites you about this program? And I'm sure you have, as many have kind of watched this program evolve over, the past several years. What excites you about them this coming season?
Well, I'm a UTSA grad back before they had football, so I'm excited that my degree gets a little cooler, every single year with more and more people kind of knowing what UTSA is. I don't have to explain what the initials stand for as much as I used to, so that's good. Now, I think on the field, you got to be excited about the offense. You returned Frank Harris, who, in my opinion, should have been the Conference USA Offensive Player of the Year last year. He leads them to a conference championship. He's a San Antonio guy. He's a fifth-year senior who's done it all there at UTSA, who's gone through a lot. Like Frank's story, he got hurt as a senior in high school. That kind of kept some of the bigger schools from recruiting him. He got hurt again his freshman year at UTSA. Like, he legitimately thought about quitting football. So for him to be leading his hometown team to their first conference championship last year in the Alamo Dome was a pretty cool story. He returns 4 offensive linemen and his 3 best wide receivers and a really good tight end. So if they can find some running backs, they're going to be pretty good offensively. Defensively is the question marks. They're replacing about half of their starters. They feel pretty good about the guys they brought in from the transfer portal, but you just never know until you get out there. They got to replace Clarence Hicks, who had 10.5 sacks last year. I don't know who their sack guy is going to be this year. They're going to have to figure that out. The scary part for UTSA is the opening part of the season. Like, they start with Houston at home, then they're at Army, and then they're at Texas. Like, that's a tough road for a G5 team. Like, Army may be the easiest team on that schedule, and Army's going to beat you up. Like, they're going to cut you. They're going to hurt you. Like, you're going to come out of that game, bruised. You're going to know you're in a football game. Traylor's going to have to kind of harken back to his high school days where it was like non-district and district, and you just kind of throw it all out after the out-of-conference season. Like, they may be the best 0-3 team in the nation, after week 3. But I do think that they're the favorite to win Conference USA alongside of UAB. And if you're UTSA, that should be the goal, right? Like, going 11-0 last year to start the year was really, really cool. But that's a mirage. That's not a thing that's going to happen every year at UTSA. You got to schedule some tough teams. You got to get some money. You're still a G5 program. That was an anomaly. I think this year's more what it is, and that's just, you go and you kind of get your teeth knocked in a couple times, maybe pull an upset, and then you go compete for a conference championship. And if you told me 5 years ago that UTSA's biggest problem is that they start 0-3 against those 2 teams, I would have laughed, right? Because those are big money problems that we didn't have 5 years ago. We were just worried about practice facilities 5 years ago. So it's nice for them to have their own weight room and just kind of be, considered a college football program alongside everybody else, and not just kind of a new kid on the block figuring it out.
Yeah, and for anyone who hasn't quite gotten the memo yet, the University of Texas at San Antonio has really become a part of that city. I was wondering what your observations have been on the impact of that team in the city. They play in the Alamo Dome. Obviously, it's a city without a professional football team, an NFL team. What has UTSA and Meet Nation done for the city of San Antonio?
I think it's brought in a lot of college football fans. Like, that's a professional sports city, and I know people probably hear that and go, well, they only have the Spurs. Well, that's a huge Dallas Cowboys city. Like you see more Cowboy stickers on the back of cars in San Antonio than you might in Dallas, right? Like, that's a huge, huge Dallas Cowboys market. I think that a lot of them were NFL fans that didn't really know much about the college football game. And with the Spurs not being that good, they're the best show in town right now. And San Antonio will show up for a winner. There was about 35,000 people in there for the Conference USA championship game. They're expecting at least 35,000 in there for that opener against Houston. I think it's really cool. It's brought a community together that, is really insular. Like, San Antonio is a community that really loves itself, right? Like, they are prideful. They want to support each other at any turn, right? Anytime, there's anything going on, they're going to be out there. And so I think it's big for the city of San Antonio. I think it's a market that's growing, that's still kind of learning college football and what it's about. And I just hope, I guess my fear is that the novice college football fans kind of just new into the game. If UTSA starts 0-3, they're like, oh, last year was just a one-off. They're not all that good. Maybe you lose a little bit of that momentum. Losing to those three teams is nothing, to snuff at. And I just hope the city kind of stays behind them. And I think they will, because they are kind of the best show in town right now.
Staying on the subject of G5 football in Texas, last night JD and I were talking about Seth Littrell and North Texas and the trajectory that his career has had there, from a time when he was getting quite a bit of buzz about being potentially hired by some P5 programs going 9-5, 9-4, to now with a losing record despite having several bowl appearances. What's the outlook for that team going into the 2022 season?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think it's like today, Austin Ani was announced as the starter for the UTEP game in week 0. They kind of got a weird thing going this year. They start with a conference game at El Paso because the Conference USA schedule kind of got thrown into the blender after Southern Miss and those two other teams, left the conference. So, we're going to find out about North Texas, right away. They lost both of their defensive ends to the transfer portal. The Murphy twins are at UCLA now. They were able to keep KD Davis, their star middle linebacker. Phil Bennett, their defense coordinator, is excellent. He turned that defensive unit around in about a year. So they're going to be probably pretty good on that side of the ball. I imagine they run the ball pretty well. They got 4 offensive linemen coming back, a couple good running backs back, even though they lost DeAndre Torrey. My thing's the passing game. Like last year as a team, North Texas threw 12 touchdowns. They threw 14 interceptions. They did not throw the ball. I don't think they averaged 200 yards a game passing. Like in modern football, if you're not running the triple, that's absurd. That's unheard of. It's not like they weren't throwing the football. They just had a quarterback that was completing 50% of his passes and throwing as many interceptions as touchdowns. And that same guy got named the starter again today. So, they brought in Grant Gunnell from Memphis. They brought in a couple young transfers, one from La Tech, one from Abilene Christian. And apparently none of those guys could beat out Austin Aune. Does that mean that he's taken, a step forward? I don't know. He's like 29 years old. I don't know how many more steps forward you can take after that long. But Seth Luttrell, kind of all offseason was like it's his job until somebody comes and takes it. I guess nobody came and took it. And it's going to be one of those things where they're going to have to rely on the running game and the defense again because it's just hard for me to imagine the passing game takes a huge step forward. But, it could be week 6, week 7, and I'm sitting here eating my words and feeling like an idiot. That's perfectly possible as well.
Mike, also in the Metroplex, we've got Rhett Lashley and at SMU. What are your thoughts on expectations, storylines for the Mustangs this year, and a very interesting skillet game that we will have in 2022 against TCU?
Yeah, that SMU-TCU sneaky kind of game of the September in the state, right? That's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be a lot of fun to see what Ford Stadium looks like. Will SMU show up? That stadium isn't always packed. Can they build a little bit of momentum back, get some pride in there, and have a good game, against their crosstown rival? I'm excited about that one. I think expectations should be high for SMU. Whatever your expectations were going to be for SMU if Sonny Dykes was the head coach, I think they should be the same with Rhett Lashley there. He was basically an inside the program hire. I know he was the OC at Miami technically, but he had been the OC at SMU, for 2 years with Sonny Dykes there. He's recruited about half the kids that are on that roster. He's the guy that helped get Preston Stone there, the backup quarterback. So, I don't think they miss a beat. SMU's problem has been the last half of the season. They've been really good until game 9, and then they've kind of fallen off the last couple of years. Can they sustain that through the year? We'll find out. They had a lot of change. They had 17 transfers come in. That's more than anybody else in the state. I think it's 3rd or 4th in the nation. USC leads the way with 19 or 20. SMU's right up there with 17. 16 of those guys are already in the 2 deep. So it's going to be a new team with a lot of turnover. Maybe that takes some time. But Tanner Mordecai is really good at quarterback. Kamar Wheaton was an Alabama running back commit. He's still got 4 years of eligibility left. He's going to be really good. Rasheed Rice is good. If that offensive line can come around, they're going to score a lot of points. With SMU, it's always about the defense. The last couple of years, I think I went when I was there to do the magazine stuff. I was talking to their middle linebacker, Jimmy Phillips, and he was like, when you think of SMU football, you think of offense. And we have to change that if we're going to be good in November. And he's absolutely right. If they're going to get good at the end of the year and really compete for conference championships, it's going to be the defense. I think the good news for SMU is that all the really good teams in the American are leaving after this year. And if you look at what's left and what's coming in, there's no reason that SMU can't position itself at the top of that mountain and become a team that dominates the American Conference for the next few years, especially if their wealthy donors are behind them, which it seems like they are by announcing that $36,000 a year for all of their scholarship football players.
Mike, I think one of the weirdest programs right now in the state of Texas has to be Texas State. What is Jake Spavital doing there? Is he going to make it out of the season? Is he going to make it halfway through the season? And what's the deal with this recruiting approach where they've signed something like 8 high schoolers in the past 3 classes, and then everything else is JUCO or other transfers?
I'm kind of on Jake Spavital's side here. I am also the guy who will argue that Texas High School Coaching Association connections are about as important as you can get in the state. But also I get why Jake Spavital does it the way he does. Take Zion Childress. Zion Childress is the perfect example. Zion Childress is a quarterback at New Caney with no real offers. Texas State comes in there, offers them, moves them to defensive back, turns them into an all-conference safety. Zion Childress is going to play this year at Kentucky, right? So, if you're Texas State and you're strapped for cash, you don't have the recruiting budget that a lot of these programs do, you're practicing indoor at San Marcos High School, right? Your weight room's not big enough to get your whole team in there. If you want to have a whole team workout, you're going to San Marcos High School, right? Like, that says everything you need to know about what Jake Spavital is working. Jake Spavital is the offensive coordinator. Because he can't afford to keep an offensive coordinator, they'd have to change the offense every single year as that guy got new jobs, right? As they got higher paying jobs. So he's working against a lot of budget restraints that a lot of people aren't. And until that changes, it's hard for me to grade him on a hard scale. I think he was ahead of the game with the transfer portal thing. It's harder to transfer the second time than the first time. So for them, they're not taking a lot of grad transfers. Like, their average transfer has 3.4 years of eligibility left. So it is kind of like high school recruiting. They're just doing it they're just waiting until they're after their freshman or redshirt freshman year. I think it's just an efficient way that he almost has to do it. You know, if given all the money in the world and all the resources in the world, I don't think he'd do it that way. But with what he has to work with, I think JUCO and transfer market route is the most efficient way for Texas State to put out a roster that's capable of competing. You know, their 4 wins last year, you know, is the most since Dennis Francione was on campus. They've never been to a bowl game. You know, they're only about 10 years into being an FBS program themselves. I do think this year's kind of a make it or break it year for him. And the only thing that may save him is if they don't have a lot of money to go hire somebody else. I will say he loves his roster. I think he really likes Lane Hatcher, the quarterback he's brought in. I think his offensive line's pretty good. He thinks the defense is going to be better. They need to get to 6 wins. They need to be a bowl team. They're the only state of Texas team in the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt's kind of on the rise. They're in position to get left behind and to be kind of a permanent basement dweller in the Sun Belt. I don't know if they can afford to do that. So a very important year for Jake Spavital. But I think when we grade and judge Texas State, there's a lot of caveats we got to place on it. And it's just, you know, part of the gig, part of the reality for him.
I think one of the curious things with Texas State also has to do with the absolute malaise that they also had in the administrative level for such a long time. I mean, I know that you've mentioned all the issues that they've had of, you know, if they wanted to go into a better facility, they could go into the San Marcos High School in order to do that. But I think a lot of that had come back to Larry Tice, the longtime AD who was well past his shelf life, who was fired this last year. Denise Trouth, who was the president of Texas State, recently stepped down. There seems to be a lot more excited with Don Coryell as the athletic director. Kelly Danthus is the president who used to be the chancellor at Arkansas State. He's come in, put in a lot of new energy. They've announced like this $36 million renovation on the south side of the stadium to increase that weight room. I mean, if you're a Jake Spavital and you're trying to do this type of pitch of, you know, you could build something, what kind of difference does it make when you have new administrators who at least show that they're not, you know, necessarily apathetic to the football program?
Yeah, I think it can be good or bad. You know, the bad side is that's probably not the guy who hired you. And so you're auditioning for your job. Maybe they just want a clean start, just to start fresh, get a guy that they're familiar with, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the good part of it is they know what the deal is. Like, they know the score. Like, Jake can go to them and be like, hey, y'all kind of know I've had one hand tied behind my back. We're starting to kind of loosen that tie a little bit. We're going to start getting into these fights in a real way. Give me a little bit of time working on an even playing field to get this thing right. Patience isn't always the number one character trait for admins and fan bases in college football. I think we all know that. I don't think anybody would blink if 4-win season got Jake Spavital fired. But I do think behind the scenes he has a real case to make. And your hope, if you're Jake Spavital, is a new admin that's a little bit more knowledgeable, a little bit more savvy, and a little bit more into the mechanism of college football will kind of understand the obstacles he's gone through and give him another year or two to work his way out of that. But like I said, on the flip side, it could be one of those where they give him this year to kind of see if he'll wow them. And if he doesn't, you know, it's a chance for them to kind of get their own hire in there and start from scratch and kind of put their fingerprint on a program. And we all know those guys like to do that. Even if things are working, they like to do that. They like to put their own fingerprint on it and be like, that's my guy, this is my hire. And so it's, like you said, Texas State's one of those sneaky storylines in the state that people who care about G5 football are going to be watching pretty closely.
I think there's one last program that we haven't been able to speak on yet, at least in depth. We mentioned UNT going against them in week 0. Out in that old Texas town of El Paso, the Miners coming off of a bowl game, first time they've been in one in a very long time. What's the forecast looking like for Dana Dimel's crew right now?
I love UTEP this year. Like, I'd hammer the over if you can find it at like 6. I would hammer it because Conference USA did them a lot of favors. Like, I really think that since I don't know if anybody would ever confirm this. This is kind of one of my fun conspiracy theories, but I think since they kind of are staying in Conference USA, they were given a pretty good schedule. Like, they don't have to play Western Kentucky. They don't have to play UAB. They get North Texas at home in week 0. And so, I think they're going to be pretty good. Dana Dimel's a miracle worker out there. This is a team that didn't win a game in 2017. That only won 1 in 2018, 1 in 2019. And then in 2020, nobody would even come to El Paso because of the COVID restrictions and all that kind of stuff. It's a city that's gone through a lot. The mass shooting, the COVID stuff hit them really hard with a big Hispanic population, obviously. It's going to be exciting. They're going to sell out the Sun Bowl for week 0 at this North Texas game. They haven't sold that place out since 2008, and that was against Texas. So if we're being frank, Texas sold that out, right? So this is a big deal for UTEP in the city of El Paso. Like we were talking about with UTSA earlier, they have a chance to really have a bunch of eyeballs on them and do something with it. If they can beat North Texas, if they can start off well and get to another bowl game, it'll only be the 3rd time in their history that they've ever gone to consecutive bowl games if they can pull that off. So there's a lot in front of UTEP. It's kind of one of those interesting programs because you think of El Paso and it's like, okay, there's 750,000 people in El Paso. It's a pretty big city, but it's off kind of on its own island. If you add Juarez, which is just right across the street, you can see it from the Sun Bowl. That's another 1.25 million people. They got 2 million people to pull from. That's a huge area, right? So, if they can get the fans interested, if they can win consistently, which they've just not been able to pull off, I think that they can really get some support there and become a very interesting program, like maybe like a Boise State or something like that. We got to remember, Dana Dimel's a Bill Snyder disciple. He knows how to do this. Kansas State stunk. Kansas State was nothing. Nobody went to Manhattan, Kansas for anything, and he turned that program around with JUCOs. If you look at UTEP's roster, it's the exact same thing. They only brought in 1 transfer. They brought in 9 JUCOs. They're still doing it the Kansas State way. Dana Dimel believes in his process, and in Conference USA, that process can work. I think that they're going to be a team that hovers around 7 wins, may even sneak in to get to 8 if things fall right. They don't have a ton of depth, but most Conference USA teams don't. So it will come down to some injuries after UTSA and UAB. Number 3 through number 8 is wide open. You could convince me UTEP falls anywhere in there.
And something else that Texas football has a wealth of is very strong FCS teams. So, Mike, who are your top 3 Texas FCS programs to watch this season?
Yeah, I think Stephen F. Austin is a true national championship contender at the FCS level. They brought back Trey Self at quarterback, Xavier Gibson at wide receiver, who's just tremendous. Xavier Gibson had 1,000 more receiving yards than any other receiver on SFA's roster. That doesn't seem real, but it's insane. It's absolutely insane. I think they're going to be really good. Colby Carthel, has won a national championship before in his time at Commerce at the D3 level. He's on his way to doing it. At the D2 level. He's on his way to doing it at the FCS level. I think the Lumberjacks are going to be really good. I think they're underranked. A lot of places have them at 10th. I think they're a top 5 team in FCS. They're going to be what Sam Houston's been for the last couple of years. They're going to be really good. I think Incarnate Word is also another one that's going to be really good. I know they lost Cam Ward, their quarterback, and Eric Morris, their head coach, to Washington State. But G.J. Kinney, they're going to put up points, right? They're going to score a lot of points. Really good running back. Taylor Grimes at wide receiver, one of the best players in FCS. One of the best linebackers in FCS also plays at Incarnate Word. So they're a sneaky good team that's been ranked. And then if we drop down beyond FCS, even to the D3 level, Mary Hardin-Baylor is the defending national champion, and so they're going to have something to say about that. Kyle King's back at quarterback. They're going to be really good. And then a team to watch if you're into, the really small school stuff is Trinity. San Antonio had an incredible year last year. UTSA went in the conference championship. UIW made the playoffs and beat SFA in round 1. Trinity went undefeated in conference play and only lost by 10 points to Mary Hardin-Baylor in the playoff. That was as close as anybody played Mary Hardin-Baylor in the playoffs last year. So Trinity and Mary Hardin-Baylor give the state of Texas 2 D3 possible championships. You got SFA and Incarnate Word as FCS champions. The thing here to remember is Sam Houston can't qualify this year. They can't play for a conference championship. They can't play for a national championship. because they're in that transition to the FBS. So I think those 4 teams are probably the ones to really watch for at the sub-FBS level.
You know, Mike, as we're continuing this conversation with other schools, you know, I'm also really curious as we've realized, you know, we kind of jumped into FCS. I do have a question before we get back into FCS. Rice, why?
That's a great question. I mean, yeah, that's a good one. If we're talking about reasons to buy Rice, you know, they won 4 games last year, but they lost 2 in overtime, right? So they're 2 overtime losses away from being a bowl game. It's hard, you know, with those restrictions there, with the grades and stuff like that, to get to Rice. Here's my thing with Rice. Like, if I'm at a school that has a hard time recruiting, I'm not going to play the type of football that they play. Like, they play like smash mouth, Stanford style, Michigan style, Harbaugh style football. Well, like, supply and demand suggests that offensive line is the toughest place to find 5 bodies. Like, Texas struggles to find 5 quality offensive linemen. Like, Alabama even went, hey, man, this is kind of hard to just, like, pound the ball against people and win 17-7. Let's just recruit really good quarterbacks and, like, go win 50-40. And, like, that was much easier, right? Like, so for me, my biggest hang up on Rice is the way that they try to go play. Like, they're not going to go outscore people. They're going to try to, you know, run, you know, I formation. They have tight ends. They have fullbacks. They're going to pound the rock. They're going to play defense, and that's great. Like, that can work at big programs where you can go get all-star offensive linemen. It's hard for me to believe it works at a place like Rice where you're just not going to get those guys. Like, there's a lot more wide receivers and quarterbacks than there are 6'7", 300-pound dancing bears that can run 4.8 and block defensive ends. And so, to me, it's kind of round peg, square hole with Mike Bloomgren. I'm a huge fan of that coaching staff. Like, they're really nice. Like, they have really great idea of what they want college athletics to be. Like, I dig it. It just feels like they've erased their margin of error. And at Rice, there's already not much because you have so many, you know, hardships in terms of getting recruits in there. You basically just eliminate 90% of guys on the recruiting trail just by your academic standards alone. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Rice. I think their secondary is really good. Their defensive line is really good. Their offense has some pieces to it, but they don't have consistent quarterback play. And in 2022, man, unless you're running like the triple or, you know, you got some like real dudes down there in the trenches, it's hard to win football that way on a week in, week out basis.
Shifting back to FCS, just a real brief bit of background. I was once an aspiring sports writer working at the Victoria Advocate newspaper in Victoria, Texas, following the Victoria East football team. Yes, shout out to Mike
Foreman, the GOAT.
The real GOAT.
Yes. So it just so happened that the year I was there, I was covering the Victoria East team, a very high-powered, very spread offense, quarterbacked by some junior named Bailey Zappy. Wondering what are your thoughts on Bailey is now in the preseason, of course, in the NFL, but just the pipeline of talent from the Texas high school level through FCS levels and, you know, for some fortunate few, even playing at the next level, even if just in the preseason.
I think it just speaks to the depth of talent within the state of Texas. Like, I think we get lost talking about who has the most NFL draft picks and is it Florida, is it California, is it Texas? Like, you know, per capita, is Georgia the best? Is Ohio the best? Like, the depth in the state of Texas is incredible. And Bailey Zappy is the perfect example. Like, even in the huddle world, even in the world where there's recruiting experts, like around every single block, like you walk out of 7-Eleven and there's like a guy with star systems, like waiting to like put in a crystal ball, right? Like, they're everywhere, but there's still guys that fall through the cracks. And Bailey Zappy at Houston Baptist and, you know, Cam Ward last year at Incarnate Word, who's now at Washington State, is another perfect example. Like, there's still guys that fall through the cracks all the time. There's still really good football that's played beyond the Power 5 level, even beyond the G5 level. And I guess that's my thing to college football fans. Like, I feel like the college football playoff in particular has kind of focused our attention on, like, only the best of the best and the sport's only good at the top. And the only games that matter are ones that have any implications to ESPN. And then everybody gets on Twitter and complains about that and, like, how that ruined college football. Well, we all have the choice not to play that game. Like, we all have the choice to watch FCS football. We all have the choice to watch G5 football. We all have those options to go, and there's really good football players. Like, you look at every roster in the NFL, there's at least one sub-FBS player on them. Like, they're all over the place. There's really good football there. And the transfer market world is also a place to scout, right? Like, now those are feeder programs, moving up into the bigger levels. They may be tomorrow's superstars at your programs as recruiting kind of changes, and there's less and less high school guys that sign with the Power 5 programs. There's going to be more and more quality players that end up at these programs just by math. And so there's a lot of good football out there. I would say don't limit yourself to what you watch. It doesn't always have to be the P5, helmet sticker teams. There's a ton of talent around the state. And if you live in the state of Texas and you like high school football, going to Victoria East, man, you can stumble on a future New England Patriot and not even know it because there's so much good high school football around the state. It's a cool place to be, and that's why my job is maybe one of the top 5-10 jobs in the state. Is because we just, all we got to do is cover the state and just focus on the state of Texas and not have to worry about anything else.
Quick station ID. We've gone a little over an hour. This is our CFB Talk 60. We are talking state of Texas football with Dave Campbell, Texas football, college football insider Mike Craven, JD Moore hosting from the Reddit CFB account. Of course, we've got Chris Derrett and Sirius as our co-host for this one. And Mike, you had said that you were willing to take a couple of questions from the audience. We have had Larry, who has been so patiently waiting for, I think, about an hour now. So I want to go ahead and welcome him up. Larry, I want to hear some of your thoughts that you've been so patiently waiting for.
Hey, well, I'm a Longhorn fan. I've been patiently waiting for an opportunity to speak at the table for a while, too, with our team. So obviously I want to ask a question about them. I mean, it feels like going into camp and going into season last year, everybody was saying, man, our defensive line is just going to be absolutely vicious. That's what every single person was really hinging on, was like, okay, our O-line won't be great, but we'll have a good front three or front four on D. I'm just wondering, it feels like all the reports are saying we're going to be better than last year. In the Big 12, I think it still comes down to offense. But, I mean, is that where we're focused on for Texas success? Is it the trenches? Because the skill is there. You're always going to have talented DBs at Texas. But, I mean, I think if you're going to judge a Texas season, like this year, it's going to be success on the O-line and D-line. Just wondering about your thoughts.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, if you look at that Alabama game, I think I could make an argument Texas has as talented as a quarterback, probably more talented at running back, more talented, at least number one wide receiver. Like they have, to your point, they have skill position guys to match up with anybody in this country. It's still O-line, D-line. What I would say about the reports is you got to remember these preseason practice reports, one, are coming from assistant coaches and coaches, right? So they're not going to say anything negative about a team. And also, you're playing against your team. So I think Texas's defensive line success in preseason camp last year was probably due to how bad the offensive line was. So there's kind of a give and take there. For me, Texas is going to score points. Steve Sarkisian is a great offensive play caller. They're always going to get skill position players. Texas is a 7-on-7 state. We have quarterbacks and wide receivers growing off trees that are going to be NFL draft picks. They're everywhere here. But Texas has done really bad, producing offensive linemen. And then on the flip side, their leading sacker last year had 2.5 sacks. That's not going to get it done. They need to find somebody off the edge. So I think Keandre Coburn's good. Devondre Sweat's good. Byron Murphy's going to be a future star. I think he's going to be really good in the middle. But who are their edge players? Who are their edge players going to be? I think the most talented ones are probably true freshmen, like a Justice Finkley. And it's hard to imagine those guys making huge impacts against Alabama, Oklahoma, Baylor, the better teams on the schedule as true freshmen. So until the trenches are fixed, I think Texas is still going to be one of those teams that struggles to be consistent week in and week out, especially moving to the SEC. I think the good news, though, is if you're looking at the recruiting classes, they're getting better on both those sides. They signed a really good offensive line group last year. They got a really good group sign, or probably going to sign again this year. Defensive line class last year was really good. So they're getting more talented up front. For Texas, it's a matter of development. They've gotten good players over the last 10 years. They just hadn't developed them well. Can this new staff develop them? I think that's still a wait and see.
Yeah, and one player I want to throw out is sort of maybe not a sleeper at this point, but just an impact transfer that I think we'll talk about more later this season is Diamante Tucker Dorsey, the FCS All-American. I think he's got to make an impact at a position of critical need, next to Overshone and Jalen Ford. So I think that'd be one guy that'll be interesting to watch.
I think that's a great point because if he is really good and Jalen Ford's what everybody says he is in camp, then you can use Overshone as that edge guy. He can be your pass rush specialist on third down, and he's really good at that, and that may be how you manufacture a pass rush. And if they can get a pass rush, all of a sudden the secondary is better. All of a sudden the run game is better. Like, it makes everything a little bit easier. Last year quarterbacks had 5 seconds to throw the ball. And, by the second half where they could figure stuff out and make adjustments, they were just killing Texas's defense. I think to your point, if the linebackers can emerge, that can help Overshown, be the pass rush guy, because I don't know if anybody else on the roster can be in 2022.
Larry, thanks for joining us. Thanks for the excellent question. Mike, we've covered a lot of ground. You gave us a lot of in-depth details on pretty much all of the major programs in Texas. What is your hottest take for 2022? Throw all caution and reason to the side, the one that you feel deep down inside. Give us something blazing hot.
I think Houston goes undefeated. I think they win at UTSA. I think they win at Texas Tech. I think Cincinnati lost so many guys that it's just hard for me to imagine if Houston does get through the regular season and the only thing stepping between them and an undefeated year is a Cincinnati team that beat them last year in Cincinnati. I'm not a huge hot take guy, so maybe that's a disappointing hot take, but I think Houston is really good. They're better than that 24th ranking with the AP, and if they can get out of the out-of-conference schedule, I think they go 12-0, and depending on how things break, I think they could be a college football playoff team if they get the national respect that Cincinnati got last year.
That is a sufficiently spicy take, and I absolutely love to hear that as well, especially with them transitioning up into the Power 5 conference, just like Cincinnati did last year. We love to see that type of representation for any kind of G5 program. And, I think you had also hit just nail on the head earlier about the idea of, we start to, at least in this version of college football, we start to really idolize the idea of the big game or trying to make sure that you get into the playoff, and you kind of forget all the beautiful stuff that you see on the lower level, whether that's going to be a rivalry game between SMU and TCU or Texas A&M having to play Texas again in the very near future with the SEC, these competitions of all these little G5 schools, of UTEP becoming an emerging power or a G5 team, or UTSA coming off an 11-win year last year, which was their best season of all time. I do really think it's incredible to watch, especially in Texas, the amount of talent that you can see and the amount of fun you can have when you actually watch some of these games.
Yeah, it's a lot. We got 47 programs in the state that play college football. That's insane, right? There's about to be 13 FBS programs. There's so much football from every single corner of the state that, believe me, you can spend your whole day only caring about Texas college football and never, run out of information to learn, right? So it's a good time, and I think everything's trending up. I think A&M and Texas moving into the SEC, A&M, doing well recruiting. I think it's a good time in the state. It's going to be really interesting to see, kind of what the Big 12 is here in a couple of years. I think that's kind of, to me, one of the more fascinating storylines of the future, and that involves 4 Texas programs, so it's a big deal here.
Mike, I'm also curious. You are a guy who you grew up in Houston, spent time in San Antonio, spent time in Austin. Now you're up in DFW. You've traveled a bunch for the magazine. I need to know, in all of these places that you've gone, what has been your favorite place to eat in Texas when you've gone and covered all over the state? And I know that's a very wide question with a lot of options, but when you think, I'm going to go visit San Antonio, I need tacos from XYZ. If I go to Houston, I need fried chicken from Frenchie's or something else like that. What are you looking at when you travel for food in the state?
Yeah, you kind of nailed one of them. Frenchie's is kind of like a childhood favorite at this point. I don't know if Frenchie's is good or if I just love it. It's just part of my DNA. So maybe it's only good to Houstonians who grew up in it, eating that. That was that fried skin on the chicken was probably the first whole food I ever ate when I got teeth or something like that. We'd have to check with my mom. I think my answer would be L&J's in El Paso. This is probably revealing what my favorite type of food is, but, give me Tex-Mex all day. Give me Mexican food all day. L&J's in El Paso is about as good as you can get, in my opinion. I love that place. It's next to a really weird, funky cemetery, which is also kind of my bag because it's got some really cool history in there. So maybe it's because El Paso is so far away, and it I only get out there twice a year as opposed to Houston. I'm there a decent amount. Austin, I'm there a lot because my family's there. San Antonio is kind of like my second home is what I consider it. So, I can always get down there. So I think El Paso is a special trip for me, and L&J's Cafe is probably the spot I most look forward to eating at least once every single season.
I don't know if it's good or if it's just what I grew up with. I think that also describes a lot of people's favorite teams, too, when we talk about fandom.
I think it describes life, really.
All the Rice fans are sitting there at home nodding right now. And by all, I mean one. I can make that joke. I'm a Vandy fan, so.
Well, Mike, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. We've done a solid hour and a quarter. This has been an awesome guest. We have loved being able to talk to you about all these awesome programs that are within the state of Texas, all the storylines to watch for them. I am more than sure that we were going to be having you on another future space to talk about the developments that have happened in Texas over the course of this season. Thank you so much for coming on board with us for a little bit, and we're looking forward to reading more of you at Dave Campbell's Texas Football. Where else can we find some of your work for this upcoming season?
Yeah, so every day, TexasFootball.com. There's new stuff up there. I think we kind of, everybody knows about the magazine, but we do a lot of, new content. Every day, a lot of fresh content, features, aggregation, all that kind of stuff. So TexasFootball.com is where to go. At Craven Mike is the Twitter account. And then we do a weekly podcast called Republic of Football. Today we had Joel Anderson on, former TCU running back, who's now at Slate. To kind of talk about the state. We have a good time. It's a live show every Wednesday at 2 that you can also catch on all your podcast platforms. So, yeah, pretty easy to find, doing a lot of work, and just glad to finally be able to write about real football and not just, projections about it for the last 4 or 5 months.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation, and we have loved being able to talk football with you, Mike. Thank you so much for coming on board. We are looking forward to talking with you again real soon.
Thank you, guys. Y'all have a good one.
You as well. On behalf of Chris Derrett, on behalf of Sirius, I am JD Moore. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation this evening. Now I'm a hang up and listen.